On a distant planet, where wild storms often tore through the landscape and the ground was scorched by the sun, there lived a man named Max. Max had spent the last few years in isolation, trying to make the best of his situation. A skilled survivalist, he was used to harsh conditions. His daily routine involved fixing equipment, scavenging for supplies, and staying out of the way of the many dangers that lurked on this war-torn planet. Max's shelter was simple, just a small, sturdy cabin made of scrap metal and stone, tucked away in a canyon where no one would easily find it. The planet had been a battleground for many years, with factions fighting for control of its resources. Max was far from the conflict, but the noise of explosions and gunfire often reached his ears, reminding him of the violence that surrounded him. One evening, as Max worked on some tools outside, the sky above him suddenly erupted into a burst of fire. A huge explosion tore through the air, followed by a streak of light falling toward the ground. The ground shook, and Max's heart raced. It was a spaceship, one of the alien ships he had seen in the past, though this one was different. It was spiraling out of control, flames trailing behind it. Without thinking, Max grabbed his pack and rushed toward the crash site, hoping that someone might still be alive. As he ran, the air grew thick with smoke, and the sound of metal scraping against stone filled the air. The ship had crashed in a rocky valley not far from his shelter, and as Max got closer, he could see the flames licking the sky. He pushed through the thick smoke, coughing as he did, his eyes stinging from the heat and fumes. Finally, he reached the wreckage. The once imposing ship was now a twisted mass of metal and fire, with parts scattered across the valley. Max looked around, searching for any signs of life. His eyes caught a movement in the debris, a figure struggling to escape the wreckage. Max's instincts kicked in. Without hesitation, Max sprinted toward the figure, a woman, or at least he thought it was a woman. She was covered in dirt and blood, her clothes singed, and her breathing shallow. Her skin shimmered in the dim light, unlike any human he had ever seen. Her eyes, though half closed, were a striking shade of purple, with a glow that seemed almost otherworldly. Max didn't care about what she looked like. All that mattered was getting her out of the wreckage. "Hang on," Max shouted as he grabbed her, lifting her out of the burning debris. She let out a weak groan, but didn't resist. Her body felt light in his arms, as if she weighed nothing at all. Max quickly carried her away from the wreckage, making sure to keep her head protected as they moved. The woman didn't make a sound as he carried her toward the safety of the nearby rocks. The smoke thickened around them, and Max could hear the crackling of the flames behind him. His heart raced. He had to get her to safety, fast. When they reached the cover of the rocks, Max gently laid her down on the ground. He didn't know what she was, but she was clearly in bad shape. Blood dripped from a gash on her forehead, and her breathing was labored. Max quickly began to assess her injuries, his survival training kicking in. He had enough supplies to patch her up. But first, he needed to make sure she was still alive. Her skin felt cool to the touch, but her pulse was faint but steady. Max's hands shook slightly as he worked, tearing fabric from his own shirt to use as makeshift bandages. He wrapped her wounds carefully, hoping she would pull through. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice her beauty. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, and her skin shimmered with an iridescent glow. He'd never seen anything like it before. When he was finished, Max sat back and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, or why she had been in that ship, but one thing was clear: she needed help, and he was the only one around. Max watched her closely, his mind racing with questions. Was she an enemy soldier, a victim of the ongoing wars, or was she something else entirely? The way she glowed, the otherworldly look in her eyes, they didn't fit with anything he had seen before. But he couldn't afford to dwell on that now. All that mattered was getting her the help she needed. As the minutes passed, Max stayed by her side, keeping watch over her. His thoughts drifted to the quiet life he had built for himself here, far away from the chaos of war. He had always kept to himself, living on the fringes of society, avoiding the conflicts that consumed so many others. But now, for the first time in years, he was connected to something bigger than himself. This woman, whoever she was, had come into his life in a way he hadn't expected. Just as he was about to check on her again, her eyes fluttered open. She looked around, her gaze confused and distant, before finally settling on Max. Her lips parted, as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. Max smiled slightly, though he wasn't sure if she could understand him. "You're safe now," he said quietly, trying to reassure her. He wasn't sure what else to say. The woman blinked slowly, her purple eyes studying him with a mix of curiosity and something else. Was it fear? Max wasn't sure. But before he could speak again, the sound of distant engines reached his ears. Someone was coming. The woman's eyes fluttered open again, this time with more clarity. Max was sitting beside her, keeping an eye on their surroundings. The air around them was thick with the smoke from the burning wreckage, but at least they were safe for the moment, tucked away in the shelter of the rocky cliffs. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important was unfolding before him, something he couldn't fully understand yet. She blinked a few times, her purple eyes wide and uncertain. Max waited patiently, giving her the space to gather her thoughts. She tried to sit up, her body still weak from the injury she had sustained, but Max gently placed a hand on her shoulder to stop her. "You should rest. You've been through a lot," he said softly. The woman looked at him, her gaze intense, as if she were searching for something in him. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. It was clear that she didn't understand his language. Max felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He had no way of knowing what she needed, or even who she was. He wasn't trained to deal with alien species. He was a survivalist, not a diplomat. But there was no denying the connection they had, a silent understanding between them. She needed him, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt compelled to help her. Max carefully stood up and began rummaging through his pack. He found some basic supplies, a bottle of water, a few energy bars, and a few medical tools. He offered her the water first, unscrewing the cap and holding it out to her. She looked at it with curiosity, then hesitantly took it from him, drinking deeply. Her fingers, though delicate, were strong, and Max noticed the soft glow of her skin, which seemed even brighter as the light around them faded with the setting sun. As she drank, Max observed her closely. She was beautiful in a way that was beyond anything he had ever seen. Her skin shimmered like polished stone, and her features were sharp and perfect, almost otherworldly. But there was something else, something that lingered in her gaze, a depth that suggested she wasn't just an ordinary person, even if he didn't know who or what she was. When she finished drinking, she handed the bottle back to him, her hand steady. For a moment, Max just stared at her, wondering if she would speak. But all she did was look at him with those mesmerizing purple eyes. She seemed to be waiting for something. Do you understand me?" Max asked slowly, though he wasn't sure why he was even asking. She hadn't reacted to his words before, so there was no reason to believe she could understand him now. Still, the question felt natural. She stared at him for a long moment before nodding slightly, though her expression remained unreadable. Her eyes held something, recognition, maybe, or perhaps it was just his wishful thinking. Max sighed and sat back down, feeling more lost than ever. He decided to try a different approach. He reached into his pack again and pulled out a small tablet, a basic communication device that could translate languages in real time, though it was far from perfect. He turned it on and held it up, hoping it might help bridge the gap between them. To his surprise, she glanced at the tablet with interest. She didn't speak, but she seemed to understand its purpose. Max carefully handed it to her, showing her how to use it. She took it in her hands and turned it over a few times, her fingers tracing the device. After a moment, she tapped the screen, and the tablet came to life with a soft beep. A voice echoed from the device, speaking in an unfamiliar language, one that was clearly not human. Max's heart raced, but he didn't back away. Instead, he watched intently as the woman studied the tablet with focused attention. After a few moments, she spoke softly into the device, her voice trembling but steady. The translation came back to him, though it wasn't perfect. "Thank you for saving me." Max blinked, hearing the words in his language for the first time. He hadn't expected her to speak at all, much less thank him. The simple act of her gratitude struck him deeply. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to feel grateful, yet she did. "I'm just glad I could help," Max replied, feeling a strange warmth spread through him. He had never been a man of many words, but something about the way she looked at him made him want to say more, to connect with her on a deeper level. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Max was trying to process the situation, to figure out what had happened. How had this woman, this alien, ended up in the wreckage? What was her story? Who was she, really? And why did she seem so different from anything he had encountered before? "I am not from here," she said after a moment, her voice barely a whisper, but the tablet's translation was clear. I am not of your kind." Max's eyebrows furrowed. "Where are you from, then?" Her eyes darkened with something Max couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or sorrow. "A far place," she replied softly. "A place of power." Max sat back, his mind racing. "A place of power," he repeated. It sounded like something out of a story, something too grand to be true. But she wasn't the type of person to speak of such things lightly. He could sense that she wasn't lying. "You're a soldier?" Max asked, though it wasn't the question he truly wanted to ask. He wasn't sure why, but he felt that there was more to her than just a soldier or a traveler. She shook her head slowly, her eyes glinting with something darker. "No," she whispered. "I am more." Before Max could ask another question, the sound of distant engines reached their ears, loud and unmistakably close. Max's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone anymore. The woman's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "They're coming for me," she said softly, her voice trembling. Max's mind went into overdrive. Who was coming for her? And why? Max's heart raced as the sound of engines grew louder. It wasn't just a distant rumble anymore. It was clear that someone, or something, was closing in fast. The woman's eyes widened with fear, her purple irises flickering with panic. She quickly looked around, as if weighing her options, but there was nowhere to run. They were trapped in the narrow valley, surrounded by rocks and the distant fires from the crash. "They're coming for me," she whispered again, her voice shaking. "They won't stop until they have me." Max tried to remain calm, his thoughts spinning. He didn't know who was after her or why, but there was one thing he knew for sure. If they caught up to her, they might not show mercy. And he couldn't let that happen. Not after everything he had done to get her to safety. "Who are they?" Max asked, his voice firm despite the growing anxiety in his chest. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the sky, her eyes narrowing as she searched for something above them. Max followed her gaze but saw nothing but the smoke and the fading light of the setting sun. The engines grew louder, and Max knew it wouldn't be long before they arrived. "They're my people," she said at last, but her tone was filled with bitterness. "Or at least, they were once. They are the ones who abandoned me." Max frowned. Her words didn't make sense. If they were her people, why would they abandon her? What could she have done to make them turn on her? Before he could ask more questions, the woman suddenly stood up, her body swaying slightly from exhaustion. She ignored Max's attempt to help her steady herself and took a step forward, her eyes scanning the horizon. Her body shimmered in the dim light, a faint glow pulsing beneath her skin. There was something undeniably regal about her now that she was standing, something that made Max feel as though she wasn't just any ordinary person. "We need to leave," she said, her voice stronger now, though still tinged with fear. "They'll stop at nothing to find me. We can't stay here." Max's mind raced as he looked around. The valley was a dead end. The only way out was through the narrow pass, and if they didn't move soon, they'd be trapped. He didn't know who was coming for her, but he knew that if they had the technology to chase her across this planet, they were likely well equipped to deal with anything she and Max could throw at them. He grabbed his pack and slung it over his shoulder. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We'll head toward the mountains. There's a pass up ahead that might give us cover." The woman nodded, her expression grim but determined. She seemed to trust Max, though he wasn't sure why. She didn't know him, and he didn't know her. Yet something about the way she looked at him made him feel that she had no choice but to trust him now. Max didn't waste any time. He took her arm gently, guiding her toward the rocky outcrop that led to the pass. As they moved, the sound of engines grew louder, and Max could feel the tension in the air. Whoever was chasing them wasn't far behind. He quickened their pace, urging her to keep moving. The narrow valley walls closed in around them, but Max pushed forward, leading the woman through the rugged terrain. She was slowing down, her steps faltering with every move. Max could see the strain on her face. She had been through too much already, and her body was starting to give way. Her injuries hadn't healed, and the stress of the situation was taking its toll on her. "Are you okay?" Max asked, glancing at her with concern. She nodded, though her face told a different story. "I will be fine," she said, but her voice was faint. "I have to keep going. We can't stop." Max didn't have time to argue. He could feel the heat of pursuit on his back. They needed to move faster, or they would be caught. He pushed forward, his own body aching from the exertion, but he didn't dare slow down. He had to keep going. He had to keep her safe. As they neared the pass, Max could see the faint outline of a structure in the distance. It was a small settlement, nothing more than a few scattered huts, but it could provide the cover they needed. He pointed toward it, his voice urgent. "Over there. We can hide there until we figure out what to do next." The woman didn't argue, though she looked back toward the horizon one more time. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time since Max had found her, he saw a flicker of anger in her expression. "They won't stop," she muttered, almost to herself. "They'll never stop until they get what they want." Max didn't know who they were, but he could tell that this woman had been through more than her fair share of hardships. There was a fire in her that he couldn't quite place, a strength that seemed to come from a place deep inside her, one that had kept her going despite everything. They reached the settlement as the sound of the engines reached a deafening roar. Max could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he glanced back. The woman stumbled a bit, but Max caught her before she could fall. They slipped into the nearest hut, a small, dilapidated building that smelled of dust and decay. Inside, it was dark, and Max immediately moved to the back, positioning them in a corner where they could see the entrance. "Stay quiet," Max whispered, his voice barely audible. "We can't let them know we're here." The woman nodded, her breathing shallow. She looked at Max, her eyes filled with both fear and something else. Something Max couldn't quite name. She was scared, but there was a sense of determination behind her gaze. She wasn't going to give up. They waited in the silence, the distant hum of the engines still echoing in the air. Max held his breath, listening for any sign of their pursuers. Would they find them? Or had they managed to escape, at least for now? The woman's eyes stayed fixed on the entrance, her body tense. She knew the danger they were in. And so did Max. They were running out of time. The sound of the engines grew fainter, but Max didn't dare relax. The woman beside him was still breathing heavily, her eyes darting toward the entrance of the hut every few moments. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Max's heart raced, and he could feel the sweat forming on his forehead as he watched the dust settle outside. They had to remain hidden. They had to stay silent. He turned to look at the woman. She was sitting on the cold floor, her legs crossed beneath her. She had her head bowed, her dark hair falling over her face. For a moment, Max thought she might be resting, but then he noticed the tension in her shoulders. Her hands, though still delicate, were clenched tightly in her lap. Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole situation. He had rescued her from the wreckage of the ship, but there was more to her story than she had let on. Every time he asked questions, she only gave him fragments of answers. The most he had learned was that she was running from her own people, but she had never explained why. And she had certainly never told him what had really happened to the ship. "I don't understand," Max finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You said they were your people, but why are they after you? What did you do?" The woman's eyes flickered up to meet his, and for the first time since they had met, Max saw something shift in her expression. It wasn't just fear, it was something darker, something that made her look older, more weathered than she really was. "I didn't do anything," she replied quietly, her voice tinged with a deep sadness. "But I was part of something that I didn't understand until it was too late." Max moved closer, instinctively sensing that she was on the verge of revealing something important. He knelt down beside her, his eyes locked on hers. "What do you mean?" He pressed gently. The woman let out a soft sigh, her gaze dropping to the floor. She seemed to be considering her words carefully, as though choosing whether or not to trust him. "I was once part of a royal family," she said, her voice filled with quiet bitterness. "But we weren't the rulers. We were just pawns in a much larger game." Max was stunned. A royal family. He had assumed she was some kind of soldier or warrior, but the way she spoke now, it was as if her entire world had been turned upside down. Max took a breath, trying to make sense of it all. "You were royalty," he repeated, his mind struggling to grasp what she was saying. "Then why were you in that ship? Why were you in trouble?" Her eyes filled with sorrow as she shook her head. "It's not what you think. I wasn't fleeing from my own people, not at first. I was a part of something much worse." Max's confusion deepened. He leaned in slightly, urging her to continue. "What do you mean?" She took a moment before speaking again, her words slow and measured. "I was part of an alliance that was formed for the sake of power. We were supposed to unite our people, but in the end, it was all about control. My family, my people, they were working with others who wanted to conquer, to destroy, to take over. They were not trying to save their world. They were trying to dominate others." Max's mind raced as he processed her words. The complexity of the situation was starting to come together, but there was still so much that didn't make sense. "So you left them? You escaped?" The woman nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of shame and defiance. "I didn't want to be a part of their plans. I didn't want to hurt innocent people, but it was too late. They knew I had turned against them. They saw me as a traitor." Max felt a pang of sympathy for her. He had no idea what it was like to be torn between loyalty to family and the desire to do what was right. He couldn't even imagine how it must have felt to turn your back on everything you had been taught, especially when your very survival depended on it. "Why didn't you tell me all of this before?" Max asked softly. "Why didn't you trust me?" The woman looked at him, and for a moment, Max could see a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "I couldn't," she whispered. "I didn't know if I could trust you. If I told you the truth, you might think I was just as dangerous as the people I was running from. I didn't want you to think I was lying." Max gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I don't think you're dangerous, but if we're going to survive this, we need to stick together. And we need to trust each other." The woman seemed to consider his words for a moment before nodding slowly. "You're right," she said, her voice more determined now. "I'm sorry. I should have trusted you sooner." Max's heart warmed at her apology, but the relief didn't last long. He could still hear the engines in the distance, growing louder once again. Whoever was chasing them wasn't going to give up. And now Max knew that the stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for justice. But the truth of the woman's past was a dangerous weapon in itself. If the wrong people learned what she had done, they wouldn't hesitate to silence her. Max didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: they were running out of time. "We need to go," Max said urgently, standing up. "We can't stay here." The woman nodded, pushing herself to her feet. Her resolve had returned, and Max could see it in the way she held herself now. The fear was still there, but there was also a fierce determination. Together, they moved toward the entrance, ready for whatever was to come. The world outside was waiting, and Max knew that their journey was far from over. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he and the woman slipped into the dense forest. The dim light of the setting sun barely filtered through the thick trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. Every step they took was measured, each one filled with caution, as they moved further away from the hut and the wreckage of the ship. He glanced over at her, the woman he had saved just a few hours ago. Her name was Solara, though it had taken some time before she trusted him enough to tell them. Her royal bloodline, her betrayal of her people, and her desire to make things right had painted a complex picture. Max had hoped to give her the time to breathe, to rest, but the past few hours had been nothing short of chaotic. The attackers were getting closer and time was running out. "We need to keep moving," Max whispered, breaking the silence between them. Solara nodded, her dark eyes scanning the forest around them. She was quick, and though the exhaustion was evident in the way her shoulders sagged, her determination kept her moving forward. Max admired that about her. No matter how hard things got, she never showed weakness. "I can hear them," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the soft rustling of the trees. "They're getting closer." Max's brow furrowed. He had heard it too. The distant hum of engines, the unmistakable sound of pursuit. Whoever they were, they weren't giving up, and it was only a matter of time before they caught up. "Do you have any idea where we're going?" Max asked, his breath quickening as he tried to push forward without making any noise. Solara paused for a moment, her gaze distant. "There's a safe house," she said finally. "It's not far from here, but we have to move fast." Max nodded. A safe house. It was a slim hope, but it was the best lead they had. They had no choice but to trust her and pray that the people she was seeking refuge from wouldn't find them first. The wind rustled the leaves, and the sound of engines grew louder. Max's pulse quickened. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wasn't used to being hunted, especially not like this. But for some reason, with Solara beside him, he felt as though they might just have a chance. "Can you run faster?" Max asked, glancing at her with concern. Solara's lips tightened into a thin line, and she gave a small nod. "I can. But we need to be careful. They'd been tracking me for a long time. I don't know how much longer I can stay ahead of them." Max's heart sank at the weight of her words. He wasn't sure what kind of enemies they were facing, but he knew they weren't ordinary pursuers. If they could track her so easily, they were likely skilled, highly skilled. Worse, they had the resources to follow her across worlds. "I'll keep you safe," Max said, though he wasn't sure how he would do that. But the words felt right coming out of his mouth. His instincts told him he had to protect her, no matter what. They picked up the pace, moving through the trees with more urgency. Max's breath came in quick bursts, his legs burning with the effort. He could see Solara was struggling too, but she didn't let it show. She kept her pace steady, her eyes scanning the shadows, always alert. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but finally, they'd reached a clearing. In the distance, through the trees, Max could see the outline of an old stone building. It looked abandoned, but it was their only hope. "We're almost there," Solara said, her voice steady despite the danger. Max didn't answer. He was too focused on the building ahead, scanning the area for any sign of danger. His hand instinctively reached for the knife tucked into his belt. The sound of the engines was almost deafening now, and he could feel the ground tremble beneath his feet. They were closing in fast. Stay close, Max said, grabbing Solara's arm gently but firmly as they sprinted toward the building. The old door creaked as Max shoved it open, and they both rushed inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. It was musty, but it offered some sense of shelter. Max's eyes adjusted quickly to the dim light inside, and he immediately moved to the corner of the room, pressing his back against the cold stone wall. Solara joined him, her breathing shallow but steady. They waited in silence, the tension unbearable. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind that blew through the cracks in the walls felt like a threat. Max kept his eyes on the door, knowing they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The attackers could arrive at any moment. I don't think they saw us, Solara said, though her voice lacked conviction. Max didn't respond. He was listening too carefully. The sound of the engines was closer now, and he could hear the distinct sound of boots crunching on the dry ground outside. Stay down, Max ordered softly. Solara crouched beside him, her eyes wide with fear. Max could feel the weight of her panic, but he refused to let it infect him. They had made it this far. There was still a chance they could make it out alive. The door creaked again, this time from the outside. Someone was trying to get in. Max's grip tightened on the knife, his mind racing. They couldn't fight these people, not in their current state. But they couldn't let them capture Solara either. The door pushed open, and Max tensed, ready to move. But then, silence. A long, tense silence. He dared a glance through the crack in the door and saw nothing. His eyes narrowed, and his heart began to pound. Something wasn't right. They weren't alone. Max's hand tightened around the knife as he crouched, his body tense with anticipation. The silence outside the safe house was deafening, every little sound amplified in the stillness. He could feel Solara's breath beside him, shallow and fast, her fear palpable in the air. He didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt like hours. His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. Who were these people after Solara? Why was she being hunted? And more importantly, what role did he play in all of this? The door creaked again, and Max instinctively pulled Solara closer, his heart hammering in his chest. The tension was unbearable. Every muscle in his body screamed for action, but he knew they couldn't afford to make a sound. They were trapped in this room, with no way out. I don't think they're leaving, Solara whispered, her voice barely audible. Max nodded but didn't speak. He had no idea what they were up against, but one thing was certain. They couldn't stay in the building forever. Eventually, the attackers would break through, and when they did, they would have nowhere to run. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the door. Max held his breath, listening carefully. The footsteps stopped just outside, and then, to his surprise, he heard a voice. "We know you're in there, Solara," the voice called, smooth and cold. "You can't hide from us forever." Max's grip on the knife tightened. Solara's eyes widened, and she instinctively reached for his arm, her fingers trembling. "How do they know my name?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I don't know," Max answered, his mind racing. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't place it. There was something unsettling about it, something that made his skin crawl. The voice spoke again, this time with more force. "We've been hunting you for a long time. Your little escape won't change anything. You're coming with us." Max's mind raced. Whoever this was, they weren't playing games. They were serious, and they weren't going to stop until they had Solara. He glanced at the window, but there was no way to escape through it. The forest outside was dark, and he knew that trying to run now would be suicide. "We need to move," Max said, his voice low. "We can't stay here." Solara shook her head, panic in her eyes. "But where will we go? They're everywhere." Max didn't have an answer. He couldn't promise her safety, not when they were up against an enemy so powerful. But one thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't let them take her. "There has to be another way out of here," Max said, trying to think. We just need to find it. Silara's eyes flicked around the room, scanning every corner. She seemed to be looking for something, anything that might help them. Then, her gaze landed on a small old trapdoor in the far corner of the room, barely noticeable under a pile of old crates. "That's it," she said suddenly, her voice filled with hope. "The cellar." Max's heart raced as he moved toward the trapdoor. He wasn't sure what lay below, but it was their best chance. He pulled the crates aside, revealing the wooden door beneath. The hinges creaked as he pulled it open, and he quickly motioned for Silara to follow him. "Stay close," he ordered. Silara hesitated for a moment, but then she followed, her footsteps light as she moved into the darkness beneath the building. Max grabbed the knife again, keeping it in hand as he descended into the cellar, trying to remain as quiet as possible. The air in the cellar was damp and cold, and the faint smell of earth and mold filled his nostrils. He could hear the faint murmur of voices above, but they didn't seem to notice the trapdoor. Silara glanced around, her expression darkening. "We're near the outskirts of their territory. They'll be looking for us, but we can't stay here." Max nodded. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. They weren't safe yet. The enemies were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they found Silara. "We need to get to a city, somewhere we can hide," Max said, scanning the area for any sign of danger. "Do you know where we can go?" Silara hesitated for a moment before answering. "There's a settlement a few miles from here, but it's dangerous. The people there aren't friendly to outsiders." Max didn't care. It was their only option. "We'll take our chances," he said, grabbing Silara's arm and pulling her toward the thick trees at the edge of the forest. "Come on. We don't have much time." They moved quickly, weaving through the dense underbrush, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. The forest was silent, almost too silent, and Max kept his senses on high alert. He had no idea if they were being watched, but he could feel the weight of the danger pressing in on them. They couldn't afford to relax, not even for a second. As they continued deeper into the forest, Max could hear Silara's breath coming faster, her steps slower. He glanced back to find her pale, her face drawn tight with exhaustion. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "Just a little tired." Max felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He knew she had been through more than anyone should have to endure, but she was strong, stronger than anyone he had ever known, and he wouldn't stop until she was safe. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a rustle in the bushes behind them. Max froze, his heart racing. He turned to look, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his side. It wasn't much, but it was the only weapon he had. From the shadows, two figures stepped forward. Max's eyes narrowed, ready to defend himself and Silara. But then he froze again, his heart skipping a beat. One of the figures was wearing a familiar uniform. "I told you they'd be here," the soldier said, his voice calm but filled with authority. He wasn't alone. The second figure, a woman with sharp eyes and a cold expression, stepped forward. Max's grip on the knife tightened, but the woman raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "We're not here to fight you," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "We're here to help." Silara's eyes widened in disbelief. You're with them." The woman nodded. "We're not with the ones who are hunting you. We've been sent to protect you, Silara, to get you to safety." Max didn't trust them, not yet, but he knew they had no choice but to listen. They were running out of time. "Then lead the way," Max said, his voice hard with determination. The woman gave a small nod, and without another word, she turned and began walking deeper into the forest, the soldier close behind. Max and Silara followed, the uncertainty of the situation weighing heavily on them. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope. As they moved deeper into the forest, Max knew the battle was far from over. But this was their chance, their one chance to escape, to finally put an end to the danger that had followed them for so long. And he would fight with everything he had to protect her.